Hello, first of all, an apology for being away for so long. Sometimes work and personal life can be overwhelming. Well, this time we will make this login form with WPF and C#. They have been asking me for a long time to do tutorials with WPF, and the time has come to do it, because I think I have already taught them enough about Windows forms. Well, in summary, we will create a window with rounded corners, gradient border color and gradient and transparent back color with a background image. As for the controls, we will create circular and pill-shaped buttons, text boxes with underline style and with icons. We will add a logo and some text blocks. Alright, let's get started with the tutorial. Here I already have a project created with WPF, C# and .NET Framework. You can choose the version you prefer. Well, I'll close this window since I won't be using it. We add a folder to store the images that we will use in the project, in my case the background image, logo and the icons for the text boxes. In the previous tutorial I mentioned that WPF is better suited to the MVVM pattern, so I'll add a folder for each component, because maybe later we'll do user authentication using a database and the MVVM pattern. Okay, in the View component we add a window for user login. Now we go to the main file of the application and change the Start window to Login View. To design the login form, just like in the Windows forms, we can drag controls from the Toolbox window and set properties in the Properties window to modify the appearance or subscribe events. Doing so creates the corresponding XAML code. However, it is preferable to design the window directly from the XAML editor, since it is much more comfortable and you can make more appearance customizations that in some cases cannot be done from the Properties window. Practically, you have more freedom and control over the design of the elements. That is also why by default, the designer workspace is divided into two main parts, the design view and the XAML view. We can customize the designer workspace as we want through these options that we have here. Another thing to note is that the designer view is synchronized with the XAML editor, that is, the design preview is in real time. On the other hand, if you have noticed, XAML is very similar to HTML, so if you already know HTML, it will be easier for you to get used to XAML, since both are markup languages and have defined schemas. Well, let's start designing the login form. Firstly, we will remove the title bar and border of the window. For this, in the window tag we set the window style property to none. We remove the resizing function since in this case it is not necessary. Then we specify that the starting location of the window is in the center of the screen. Optionally, we change the height of the window to 550. Finally, we subscribe to the mouse down event to return the drag and move function of the window, since removing the title bar from the window loses this functionality. If you want, you can subscribe to this event from a custom title bar. I'll make the form draggable from anywhere. Talking a bit about WPF, to build a window with a good design, you use panels as a container for other child elements. The panels are components that control the representation of elements, such as their size, dimensions, position, and the arrangement of their contents. There are 5 main types of panels. Stack panel. This panel organizes secondary elements in a single line that can be oriented horizontally or vertically in a stacked way, that is, it is placed one after the other. Dock panel allows docking the child elements to where we want them to stay, either to the left, up, right, or down. Grid is the most powerful panel in WPF, which allows to define a flexible grid area consisting of columns and rows. Child elements can be precisely placed in each row and column. Wrap panel allows to place the secondary elements in a sequential position from left to right or from top to bottom, and moves the content to the next line so that it is always visible. That is, it automatically rearranges the elements when they no longer fit in the panel area. Canvas is the simplest panel of all, since it allows to place the secondary elements explicitly by means of relative coordinates that we specify. However, none of these panels support drawing a border around their edges, so it is also not possible to make the container have rounded corners, which is why there is also the border decorator element that allows you to draw a custom border around another element, so we will use this decorator border to create the window with rounded corners and gradient border color. So, we define the border tag. We set the corner radius property, for example a value of 50, then we set a background color, in my case I'll use a pale dark blue. We set the border color and border thickness. Alright, now we have the base of the form with rounded corners. Now we just need to remove these extra white corners from the window. The trick to doing this is to set the background color of the window to transparent. We also need to set the allow transparency property to true for it to take effect. Okay, we already have the window with the rounded corners and border. We can make the border a gradient color. Similarly, we can set a gradient background color. So, we remove the border brush set earlier, and set the border brush property using tags to create and set a gradient color. You could say that this is an advanced way of setting a property of a control. Well, we define a linear gradient brush, or if you prefer radial. Then we set the angle of the gradient. This is defined by two-dimensional coordinates, that is, the start and end point of the line. By default the start point is 0, 0, and the end point is 1, 1, which represents a diagonal line, so we can change the angle by changing the value to decimal values. In this case, I'll leave it at the defaults since I want a diagonal linear gradient. Then we set the colors and an offset along the brush's gradient axis. Here I already have a defined color palette. You can use the colors you want. Then we set the location in the linear gradient, that is, from where we want the gradient stop color to start, in this case from point 0. We do the same for the other colors we want to add for the linear gradient. We set the offset for each gradient color however we want. We do the same thing if we want to set a gradient background color. We remove the previously set background property, since the same property cannot be set twice, and we set the border's background property using tags to set the background in an advanced way. In this case, I'm going to invert the angle of the diagonal gradient. You can set decimal values if you want a different angle. Great, we can also set an image behind the background color. To do this we wrap the defined border with another border. In the same way, we set the corner radius property, and set an image as the background of the border. As the image source, I'll select the background image I added at the beginning of the tutorial. To make the image visible, we lower the opacity of the background color of the front border. We set a value that best suits the image and is pleasing, for example, an opacity of 50% or 90%. You can also make other adjustments to the image, for example stretch mode, mosaic, alignment, and among others. Well, let's run the application to see how it turned out. You can change the location of the second color of the gradient to 1 so that the offset is from the endpoint. We can reduce or increase the thickness of the border and the radius of the corners of the window to our liking. In the top right corner, the image sticks out a bit, so I recommend setting the image border corner radius to a larger value. Alright, now inside both borders, we define a grid to organize the child items in a more custom way. We then define two rows. The first row we set a height of 30 in auto width, and the second row with auto size. If the height and width are not set explicitly, by default it is automatic, that is, the size will be proportional or will occupy the remaining space, as in this case, the first row has a height of 30 and occupies the entire width of the window, and the second row occupies all the remaining space in the window. Well, now we define another grid to organize the title and the close and minimize buttons, but in this case, we will define columns, for example about 4 columns. As you can see, by not specifying the size, by default it is automatic and proportional, and it also occupies the first row previously defined as the default location. Well, we set the width of the second column to 25, just like the third column. In the last column, we set the width to 5, since it will only be used as a right margin mode. Well, we define a text block for the subtitle of the window, for example login. We set the text color, font size, and font type. Then we specify in which column the text is going to be placed, in this case the first column, which would be the ordinal position 0. We set the vertical alignment to center. Then we also set a margin of 10 on the left so that the text is not too close to the edge of the window. The way to set the margin values is as shown in the image, left, top, right and bottom. Now we define a button to minimize the window. We set a name, background color, and border thickness to 0. I didn't download a minimize icon image, so I'll set a dash symbol as text. We also set the font color, size, and font type. We establish the cursor to hand, and indicate that it is located in the second column, that the ordinal position would be 1. Finally, we subscribe the click event to minimize the window. We copy the button to the close window button. We change the location to the third column, and make the other corresponding adjustments. Similarly, we subscribe to the click event to close the application. Great! However, here is a great detail. Although in WPF you can do many appearance customizations, there is no way to change the background color when hovering over the button, nor to change the radius of the corners, at least not in a direct way. To do so you have to override or modify the button's default style and template to give the control a custom appearance. So, let's modify the default style of the button. For that we first remove the previously set background color, and modify the style of the button. We set the background color of the button using the setter tag. Then we set triggers for the button. A trigger is an object that allows to apply changes or perform actions when a certain condition is met. For example, in this case, if mouse hovers over button, we change the background color of the button. Alright, for this to take effect we also need to override the button's default template. We define a border, set a width and height of 18, or whatever size you want. Then we set the radius of the corners, for example half the height, so that the button is circular. Then we bind and sync the background color of the button to the background color of the border. Finally, we center the content of the button both vertically and horizontally. Well, we already have the circular button, we copy the style and template for the close button, and we make the corresponding changes. In order not to repeat the same code in all the buttons or controls, it would be better to create a custom template and apply it to the controls that we want and when we want. In the next tutorials I will show you how to create control templates. Okay, the background color of the buttons changes correctly when hovering over it. Well, that's it for the first row of the window. Now we define a stackable panel to organize the login elements, set a width of 250, and indicate that it is located in the second row of the grid. We then specify that the elements stack vertically, and finally we set a margin of 35 at the top. We define an image for the logo. We define a text block for the main title. We define another text block to show a motivational message. Here is a good phrase that I copied from the internet. Since this sentence is long, we are going to wrap the text inside the panel, and we can also change the alignment to justified or centered. Well, we finally set a top margin of 5 since it's very close to the title. We add another text block for the username label. Now we define a text box to enter the username. We set the background color to transparent, text color to white, text insertion cursor color to light gray, or the color you prefer. We set the border color to dark gray. The text box will have an underline style, so we set the border thickness to just the bottom. If you want, you can set the border to the entire outline. In height we set 28 and center the vertical content alignment. Finally, we set a margin of 5 on top. Alright, now we will add an icon on the left side of the text box. There is no property that allows to insert an icon to the text box. The solution is to set the icon as the background, and then we remove the previously set background, and set the background directly from the property. We define an image brush and set as image source the icon we want. By default, the image is stretched over the entire area of the control, so we set the stretch mode to none, and align the icon to the left. The text is written over the icon as the image is the background of the text box. To fix this we need to set a padding to the left. In this case, the icon is 16 pixels wide, so I'll add a padding of 20 to the left. Great! You can change the border color when the text box is focused. To do this you have to modify the default style and template just like we did with the buttons. I won't do it now because the default color matches my color palette. Well, we duplicate the text block and text box for the user's password, and make the corresponding changes. Since the field is of type password, then we change the text box to a password box to hide the characters. Alright, now we will add a button for login. So as not to do everything from scratch, we copy the circular button defined earlier. We set a margin of 50 on top. We set a width of 150 and a height of 40, or the size that you prefer. To have controls with circular lateral sides, you should always set half the height value as the corner radius value. Finally, we set the background color, and the background color when hovering over the button. Okay, to finish, we add a text block to ask the user if he forgot his password, and another text block to reset the password. Finally, we can stack these two text blocks horizontally, so we wrap both text boxes in a stackable panel. In orientation we specify that the elements are stacked horizontally, we center the panel, and we set a margin of 15 at the top. We also set a margin of 8 to the left in the reset password text block. Okay, everything is in order. You can make the changes you want. I will leave a download link of the project in the video description. Well, that's all in this tutorial. I hope you liked it, and until next time.